In today's lesson, we are going to discuss the content of chapter 1. Let us begin. The story begins by an introduction to Lacey. We are told that she has passed her common entrance and becomes the first in her family to win a place at a government secondary school in La Porta. We're also introduced to her father, who is presented as a largely absentee father or parent who suddenly appears and is proud of her achievements. He offers for her to live with him in La Porta and his wife, Miss Velma, and their son Michael, in the town for schooling. This, they believe, will make it easier for her. Lacey's grandmother, Ma, initially resists, but eventually agrees, seeing the practicality of the arrangement, especially since the daily commute from Ballytere would be long and costly. There is a family celebration of Laetitia's success, though her grandmother remains wary of her father's motives. Remembering is neglect. Lacey is finally seen in her father's car, moving to live with her father and his wife, Miss Velma, in La Porta, where she must adjust to a new environment, new family dynamics, and the realities of living away from home. Let's take a look at the setting and the different environments. Firstly, we are introduced to Lacey's home, Suklal trees. This is where Lacey lives, in a rural, underdeveloped community. The road is full of bumps and holes, so when her father drives her down the trace in the noisy old car, she says on page 3, the car was old and it made a lot of noise over the bumps and holes in the road. That line makes us feel how rough and neglected the area is. And daily life there isn't easy. People fetch water, wash clothes in pans, and even bathe outside by barrels. Lacey observes this on page 2. She says some were taking water from their barrels at the side of the road, washing clothes or bathing. Compared to La Porta, the nearby town where Lacey is now moving to, it is described with pride as modern, with two-story school buildings, which is seen on page 6. So right away, the Trace, where Lacey lives, and La Porta represent two different worlds. One, hardship, versus the other, opportunity. Now let's take a look at the historical and political environment. At the center of it all is the common entrance. This exam determined who could move up to secondary school. Lacey celebrates this on page 7, saying, my name was right there in the newspaper among all the other children who had passed the common entrance. Passing this exam wasn't just about school, it symbolized social mobility and national progress, especially since the government secondary school itself is described as the biggest and most modern thing in La Porta. Evidently, education here is political, historical, and deeply tied to the theme of upward mobility. Finally, let us take a look at the social environment. Now, the social and cultural environment are intertwined here. The Trace is a closely knit community where everyone watches each other. Laetitia noticed on page 2 that people stopped whatever they were doing in their yards and peered at us. And this is when she was in her father's car, driving down the trace, moving to La Puerta. Because transportation is so limited in the trace, just riding in a car becomes a big deal. Education, again, shines as a source of pride. Lacey is the first in her family to pass the common entrance, and she reflects on page 7 that I would be the first one ever, the first one in the family to go to secondary school. Papa even makes it a spiritual celebration. And on page 7, she says, Papa made speech after speech about the new and blessed day that was dawning on the land. And really, what is a Caribbean celebration without food, drinks, and dancing? On the same page 7, Lacey says, Papa right away sent Uncle Leroy out the road to knock on Rampy's side door for a bottle of rum and some sweet drinks. We also see gender expectation when Arville, Lacey's father, turns her success into pressure for her brother. He laughs and says on page 4, well, you know what you have to do now. You can't let girls beat you. At the same time, respect for education is clear. Relatives like Tanti Velma, who went to high school, are admired. On page 7, her father says, yes, man, she is the one in the family with education. She was a high school girl too. Overall, chapter one's setting paints a vivid contrast. Poverty and the community in the trace, modernity and progress in Laporta. It also reminds us of education, gender roles, and traditions. All of these themes will shape Lacey's journey. Let's take a look at the characters in the story. So these are all the characters mentioned in the story. First up, Lacey, our narrator and the protagonist. We do not get a physical description of her in this chapter, but we do learn a lot through her actions. Think about it. She's traveling with not just a suitcase, but also a whole box of books. That tells us about her big determination. She treasures these books, and they symbolize her love for reading and her academic curiosity. Laetitia is also emotionally complex. She feels embarrassed riding in her father's noisy old car while everyone in Suklal Trace stops to stare. And this is repeated on page 5. She said, I couldn't even wave at her. I wanted to sink down in the car seats when Miss Adeline begs for a lift. That moment shows her sensitivity and guilt. She notices the hardship others face and feels bad for not being able to help. At the same time, she's incredibly proud but modest about her achievements. She reflects on page 7. I would be the first one ever, the first one in the family to go to secondary school. Instead of boasting about it, Lacey, she thinks about what this means for her family. So Lacey's role is clear. She is the center of the story, and her exam success sets everything in motion. Now let's take a look at Lacey's father, Arville Cephas. Arville has been absent most of Lacey's life, but suddenly, after her success, he shows up. And he shows up loud and proud. He's overly excited, constantly grinning, talking about books and trying to impress her, but also exposes his own insecurities by admitting on page 4, I didn't get picked to go to secondary school. I only make it to 7th standard. Here his pride turns into a competition, which when he laughs and says to her brother, you can't let girls beat you on page 4, the line reveals both gender expectations and is needed to both. But Arvel's pride isn't perfect. It is far from it. He's careless, nearly running into barrels and even cursing at a dog in the trees. He doesn't stop to give Miss Adeline and her young baby a ride either, which shows he's inconsiderate. His car, old and noisy, becomes a symbol of him. Flashy in appearance, but unstable underneath. In this chapter, his role is big. He represents paternal pride, but also neglect. His reappearance marks the shifts in Lacey's life from village to town. Now let us take a look at Lacey's grandmother, Wilhelmina Johnson, also known as Ma. She is presented in chapters 1 as the matriarch of the household, and in all the chapters, to be fair. And she is seen as Lacey's main caregiver while her mother, Mama Patsy, works in New York. Normally, Ma is stern and serious, but in chapters 1, we see her a little bit different. During the celebration of Lacey's success, we see another side of her. She actually gets tipsy. And this is seen on page 7. She was dancing with the children one by one. That moment shows her deep pride and joy. She presents stability, guidance, and tradition. Finally, let us take a brief look at Papa. If there is one thing, Papa loves giving long, biblical style speeches. He turns Lacey's success into something almost sacred, declaring on page 7, "Now a new and blessed day that has dawned on this land." He drinks, dances, and celebrates like Mama, but always frame these moments in terms of family and faith. His role is important, but he symbolizes tradition and continuity. He shows us how elders interpret education, not just as success for one child, but a triumph for the entire family and the community. Now, let us move on from characters to narrative techniques and literary devices. Let us begin with the first person narration. Here we see that the whole story is told directly through Laetitia's eyes and voice. That means we don't just see what happens, we actually experience how she feels about almost everything. For example, on page 4, when she says, "I couldn't even wave at her," in reference to Mrs. Adlin, "I wanted to sink down in the car seat." We immediately feel her embarrassment and guilt as Miss Adlin waves while begging a drive and carrying the heavy load and the baby. The effect here is powerful because it makes the story deeply personal and authentic, giving us access to Lacey's emotions as she navigates both pride and discomfort. Let's take a look at the use of contrast as a narrative technique. This chapter is full of contrast between rural life and urban life, poverty and progress, tradition and change. Think of the line 2, where it says, "Some were taking water from their barrels at the road," versus page 6. "The government secondary school was the biggest and most modern thing in Laporta." The effect here is clear. It highlights one of the novel's central themes, the tension between hardship and opportunity. Education, therefore, becomes a bridge between these two worlds. Let's also look at the narrative technique imagery. We both get to see visual and auditory imagery that makes the setting feel more real. For example, on page 3, it says, "The car was old and it made a lot of noise over the bumps and holes in the road." You can practically hear the rattling car. Or when Laetitia describes the students in the town on page 6, the way they took over the streets in their plaid uniforms, talking and laughing gaily, as if they owned the town. Now, this is important because the imagery is to draw us right into her world. We see and hear what she does, hearing from her awe, embarrassment, and pride. Now, let us take a look at irony. Arville, her father, is full of contrast. He brags about his daughter's success but admits on page 3 to 4, "Although I wasn't so bright as you, I didn't get picked to secondary school. I only made it to 7th standard. You can't let girls beat you." Now, this is irony because here he is both celebrating her achievement and exposing his failure, while also pitting her against her brother. Now, the effect is that it highlights gender bias in this family, this new family that she will be a part of. Now, bear in mind, this is not something that Lacey is used to. This kind of competition between her cousins and her family members. We don't see this in Mama's household. But here, Arville is presenting that this will be something within his home. The hypocrisy of an absentee father suddenly claiming pride and the unfair pressure put on children. Now, all of these things are ironic. Finally, let us take a look at characterization as a narrative technique. The author doesn't spell everything out. Instead, we learn about people through what they say, what they do, and how others react to them. Lacey comes across as dynamic, as proud, as bookish, or in the Caribbean, we might call him a nerd, modest, and at the same time, sensitive. Arville, on the other hand, is presented as a static character, always boastful, talkative, and careless. For example, his behavior in the car and his teasing of his son shows us his personality without the narrator needing to explain it outright. The effect is realism. We feel like these are real people, real family members with flaws, strengths, and contradictions. So when we put it all together, first person narration, contrast, irony, imagery, and even characterization, these techniques not only make the chapter vivid, but connects with the theme of family, education, rural versus urban life, and the pressures that comes with social change. With that being said, let us take a look at the use of literary devices in chapters 1. So we are introduced to visual and auditory imagery, and that was mentioned earlier. The effect of this is that it paints a clear picture of rural life, showing poverty and the daily struggles of the community in which Lacey lived. It also helps the reader vividly imagine the environment and sympathize with the villagers' hardship, like Miss Adlin, while also contrasting with Letitia's chance at progress. We also see an example of auditory imagery, which is presented on page 3, and that was also mentioned earlier. Situational irony is also presented, where we see that on page 4, you can't let girls beat you. This irony lies in the fact that instead of celebrating Lacey's achievement, her father turns it into a pressure for her and her brother, and a means of competition too. The effect is that it reveals gender bias, family dynamics, showing how pride in success is undercut by patriarchal societies. Finally, the use of contrast, which was also mentioned, the contrast between Sokol Trace and La Porta. Let us now move on to the symbols in chapter 1. One of the most powerful symbols is Lacey's box of books. She doesn't just bring a suitcase, she brings an entire box filled with her books. Her father even noticed, and on page 3, he says he was impressed with the books I had to put into the car along with the suitcase. That moment shows how unusual, yet important her dedication is in the rural setting. The effect is that these books symbolize Lacey's love of learning and her belief in education as a way out of poverty. In a Caribbean context, where exam like the Common Entrance was a gateway to opportunity, those books became her own journey or her own vehicle of progress, just as her father's car. Let us take a look at the motor car as a symbol. Arvel's car is another striking symbol. It is described as old and makes a lot of noise over the bumps and holes in the road. And for Lacey, it's a source of embarrassment than pride. She says this on page 4. She sinks down into the seat when one of her neighbors stares. The effect here is twofold. The car represents upward mobility for Arville and social status, setting Arville apart in a community where most people wait by Rampage shop for buses. But the irony is that the car is noisy and unreliable, just like Arville and his role as a father, quite shaky and unpredictable. For Lacey, the motor car symbolizes the bumpy, uncomfortable shift from rural poverty to the promise of urban education. While Rampage Shop is a minor symbol, it is still a symbol. It's a simple landmark that carries meaning. It's where the villagers wait for buses, chat, or sometimes give up and take a taxi. So Rampage Shop symbolizes the slower pace and limitations of village life. Lacey, who is being whisked away directly to town by a car, it highlights the contrast between old routines and the new pathway of opportunity. Let's take a look at the barrels of water. Now, barrels of water are very Caribbean symbols of rural life. It's a part of the Caribbean, especially in rural communities. In Letitia's village, people are described as taking water from barrels at the side of the road, washing clothes, and bathing. The effect of this is that the imagery shows poverty and underdevelopment in Sokol Trace. There is no running water, obviously, just barrels of water, maybe rainwater. But it's also about resilience because despite hardship, the community survives with what they have. Finally, let us look at two other things. One being Papa's speech. Again, it is a simple and possibly a minor symbol, but his speeches are symbolic in themselves. And we're told this on page 7. The effect of these biblical style speeches is to elevate Letitia's success into something sacred, almost national, like a national pride. It is for the family. Papa's words become a motivator of tradition, pride, and moral authority, linking education to family duty and even a divine blessing. Then we have so-called trace. The word trace in the Caribbean refers to a small, narrow road or path, often found in rural areas, usually unpaved and connecting houses or fields. In chapter 1, so-called trace symbolizes poverty, community, and tradition. Its poor infrastructure is captured in the line on page 3, which shows both the physical hardship of the place and its underdevelopment. At the same time, the trace represents closeness and familiarity. As Lacey explains on page 2, people stopped whatever they were doing in their yards and peered at us, reflecting a community where everyone notices and responds to each other's lives. However, the trace also highlights limitations and struggles, since Miss Adeline's journey is described on page 4. Now, this is important because the trace symbolizes the rural environment that Lacey is leaving behind, a space of both support and struggle, a space that is familiar to her, in contrast to the modern opportunities that she will face at La Porta. Finally, we see education as a symbol. The common entrance examination and the government secondary school embody progress, opportunity, and upward mobility. Lacey says on page 7 that I would be the first one ever to go to school, and on page 6, she describes it as the biggest and most modern thing in La Porta. This is important because it highlights education as a pathway to a better future, while also hinting at the challenges and pressures that comes with being the first to succeed. Now let's take a look at the themes presented in chapter 1. Rural versus urban. This theme is shown through the contrast between so-called trace and La Porta. 2. Family. Family pride and unity are emphasized during the celebration of Lacey's success with eating, drinking, dancing, singing, and Papa's long speeches. It shows that one child's success or achievement is seen as a victory for the entire household. 3. Parent-child relationship. We see Lacey's relationship with her father is marked by distance and irony. He reappears after her success, showing his pride. We also see the theme of poverty, which is 4. This is depicted in the villagers' reliance on the barrels of water, limited transportation, and the struggles that we see Miss Adeline face on this long road to the clinic. It underscores the harsh realities of rural life. 5. Education is presented as a rare and precious opportunity, symbolized by Lacey's box of books and the impressive secondary school in La Porta. Passing the common entrance is celebrated as life-changing. 6. Upward mobility. This Lacey's success in the exam represents the possibility of moving beyond poverty into progress and a better life. Both her books and her father's car symbolizes the steps towards status and social advancement. And finally, cultural tradition appears in the way of the family celebration, the speeches, the rum drinking, etc. This has taken us to the end of the video for today. Please remember to like this video, leave your comment, subscribe to my channel. Do not forget to hit that good old notification bell, and I will see you in the next video.